The storm had rolled in fast, the kind that turned dirt roads into rivers and made even the strongest men shiver beneath their coats. Most folks in the town of Hollow Bend bolted their doors and pulled the curtains tight, pretending not to hear the thunder or the desperate knocking at their gates. But not him. In the middle of the downpour, with the wind howling like a dying beast, one man opened his door to a stranger soaked to the bone, hat crushed in his hands, eyes full of something he hadn't spoken in years, fear. No one knew who the man was or what chased him through the rain. But the one who offered shelter didn't ask. He just stepped aside. In a town that judged you by your boots and how many cattle you branded, giving kindness without a reason was a language few remembered. Yet, this man, known more for solitude than sermons, saw something in the stranger that the rest of the world had forgotten: humanity. He handed him a dry blanket, poured a cup of coffee that steamed like hope, and listened without expecting answers. It was a quiet act, easily overlooked. But in the Old West, where mercy was rare and trust rarer still, it was the kind of moment that could shift the course of a lifetime. What happened in the days that followed would become the stuff of whispers and wide eyes. Riders began showing up at dawn. 1, then 3, then 20, until the dirt outside his porch was trampled flat by hoofprints. No one knew how the word spread, or what bound these men together. But they came armed not with rifles, but with respect. 300 riders strong, they didn't come for vengeance. They came to ride beside a man who, without even knowing it, had done something legendary. He had helped the right stranger at the exact wrong time, and that made all the difference. Some folks in Hollow Bend thought it was a show of force. Others said it was a test of loyalty. But those who understood the West, the real West, not the one in dime novels, knew better. This wasn't about muscle or might. It was about honor. About a man who had stood alone in the rain, and now stood at the center of something much greater than himself. He had offered his home, without knowing he was offering history a place to rest. Stay with me, because this isn't just a story about thunder, horses, or the echo of hooves through dry streets. It's about what happens when one act of decency lights a signal fire across the plains. When a man chooses kindness in the quiet, and the world answers back with the sound of 300 saddles moving as one. What began in the rain would end with a ride that no one would forget, and a truth that still rides with us today. The man who opened his door that night was named Elias Ford. He was no lawman, no preacher, and certainly no hero in the eyes of Hollow Bend. He kept to himself, lived off the edge of town with 2 mules and a rusted tin roof, and spoke only when spoken to. Folks said he was a soldier once, but no one knew for sure. What they didn't know was that he didn't ask questions, not about where you'd come from or what you were running from. So when the strangers stumbled onto his porch that night, soaked and breathless, Elias didn't reach for a gun. He just reached for the lantern. The stranger looked like he hadn't eaten in days. His coat was torn at the sleeve, and his boots were worn through at the soles. But what struck Elias most wasn't the stranger's condition. It was the silence in his eyes. Not fear, not desperation, just silence. Like a man carrying something too heavy for words. Elias didn't push. He brought out a dry shirt, boiled a kettle, and gestured toward the fire. The stranger took it all without saying much. Just a nod here, a murmur there. Sometimes, silence speaks louder than screams. As the rain beat against the windows, Elias noticed the man's hands trembling, not from cold, but from restraint. They were scarred hands. Not fresh wounds, but old ones. He recognized them. He'd seen them on men who'd held the line too long, who'd buried more than they'd ever spoken about. There was weight in the way the stranger held his cup, like even a sip required effort. And Elias, who had once carried his own ghosts across miles of forgotten battlefield, knew better than to ask. Sometimes, you don't speak until the words come on their own. By dawn, the rain had stopped, and the stranger was gone. Left nothing but the folded shirt on the table and a single bullet on the windowsill. Elias stared at it for a long time. A message, maybe, a warning, or a thank you from someone who didn't know how else to show it. He didn't tell the sheriff. He didn't tell the barkeep. He just tucked the bullet into a drawer and went about feeding the mules. That might have been the end of it, just a strange night in a quiet man's life. But Hollow Bend wasn't quiet for long. 3 days later, riders began arriving. First just one, a young man with a tattoo of a broken star on his neck. Then two more, both wearing dusters marked by the same strange stitch. By the time the sun had set, there were 23 horses tied outside Elias's fence. None of the riders spoke much. They asked for Elias by name, and when he stepped outside, they didn't draw. They dismounted, tipped their hats, and stood like soldiers before a general. Elias didn't know what was coming, but the land did. The air had shifted, and the silence from that rainy night was now moving on 400 hooves. Elias didn't recognize a single face among the riders, yet something about the way they moved, their discipline, the precision with which they waited, told him everything he needed to know. These weren't drifters or bounty hunters. These men had served together, somewhere sometime, maybe not in an army, but in something forged by danger and bound by loyalty, the kind of bond born from bullets and blood. And they weren't here for Elias. Not exactly. They were here because of the man he'd sheltered, the one who vanished into the rain and left a bullet behind. That evening, around the fire pit outside the barn, one of the riders finally spoke. His name was Jonah, tall and quiet, with the look of a man who'd buried too many friends. He told Elias the truth, or at least enough of it to make sense. The man Elias had taken in was known only as Holt. He wasn't a criminal, but he wasn't innocent either. He had once led the men, now gathered around Elias's property. They weren't outlaws. They were survivors of a war that never made it into the newspapers. A private war, fought on the edges of the frontier, against men too cruel for the law to name. According to Jonah, Holt had done something final, just before the rain, something that made enemies of powerful men, the kind of men who didn't knock when they came for you. But Holt hadn't run to save himself. He had run to lead them away, to give his brothers time. He chose to vanish, Jonah said, but he left us the trail. And the trail, it seemed, led straight back to Elias Ford. Because Elias had done what no one else would. Opened a door without asking who stood behind it. The next morning, there were nearly 50 riders on Elias's land. Hollow Bend was already buzzing. The sheriff rode out with 2 deputies, more out of curiosity than authority. When he arrived, Elias stood in the yard, arms crossed, watching a black horse being saddled by a man with a silver braid in his beard. "You planning to start a war, Ford?" the sheriff asked. Elias didn't answer right away. He looked around, at the men, the horses, the rising dust. Then he said, "Not starting one, but I reckon we're finishing something." Word spread like wildfire. By the end of that day, there were over 100 men on Elias's land. Not a gang, not a militia, just a gathering of loyalty, forged by something most men spend a lifetime chasing and never find: honor. And at the center of it all stood Elias Ford, a man who had done nothing but show kindness in the rain, now standing shoulder to shoulder with ghosts who had returned, not to fight, but to ride with him. The sun rose over Hollow Bend with a strange kind of silence. Not the stillness of peace, but the quiet that comes before something sacred begins. Elias stood by the fence post, looking out over the open plain, now filled with riders, over 120 strong. Some wore pieces of old uniforms. Others rode with relics tied to their saddles, dog tags, tokens, scars. Every one of them had answered an unspoken call, not from Holt, and not for vengeance, but for the man who gave Holt a roof, a fire, and a moment to breathe when no one else would. Down in town, fear and wonder walked hand in hand. The storekeepers, the blacksmith, even the saloon girls, all watched the line of horses stretching into the horizon. Whispers turned to questions. Who are they? Why are they here? But no one dared approach. No one, that is, except for a boy named Caleb, barely 10, with dust on his knees and more curiosity than sense. He rode out alone on a mule too small for the trail, reaching Elias's farm just as the riders were forming up for morning drill. Elias met him at the gate. "Are you the man they came for?" Caleb asked. Elias shook his head. "I'm the man who let someone in." That afternoon, Elias was approached by the eldest of the riders, a man they called Brass. His face was carved by time, his hands full of silence. "We aim to ride in a Hollow Bend at dawn," he said, voice like gravel. "Not to fight, not to scare, just to show him what it means to stand for someone." Elias didn't blink. "You're not riding for me." Brass smiled faintly. "You gave our captain a night of peace. We're giving the world a day of truth." And that was it. No grand plan. No speeches. Just riders, honor-bound by something few understood and fewer lived by. That night, Elias sat alone on the porch, polishing an old rifle that hadn't seen the light in years. He didn't expect to fire it. He didn't even expect to carry it. But something about the ride ahead made him want to feel the weight of it again. In the distance, songs rose around the camps. Low, wordless hymns carried on the wind. They weren't songs of war. They were songs of farewell. Because every rider knew the truth. Sometimes, a ride isn't about arrival. It's about being seen. About bearing witness. As midnight passed, the moon rose high and the campfires dimmed. Riders slept in shifts, boots tucked beneath their saddles, rifles within arm's reach. Elias didn't sleep. He stared at the sky, thinking about Holt, about the rain, about the bullet left on his windowsill. He thought about choices, about what it cost to be kind in a world that punishes softness. And as the first light of morning touched the ridgeline, he stood, dusted off his coat, and whispered a single phrase into the wind. Let's ride. They came in rows of 10, quiet, measured, undeniable. The town of Hollow Bend had never seen anything like it. 300 riders, side by side, not a word spoken between them, only the steady sound of hooves hitting dry earth. Elias rode at the center, not leading, not following, just present. His coat was plain, his rifle slung over his shoulder, but his presence was thunder without noise. Windows opened, curtains parted, and from every doorway, people watched something ancient, something righteous, pass through their lives like a slow-moving storm of reckoning. The sheriff stepped into the street, hat pressed to his chest. He didn't say a word, didn't dare. He knew what this was. It wasn't a parade. It wasn't a protest. It was a living memory being written in real time, one that would outlive them all. Behind Elias rode Jonah, Brass, and others with eyes that had seen too much and yet chose, even now, to ride for something greater than pain. Not revenge, not pride, but tribute. Because Holt had trusted Elias. And Elias, by opening his door, had unknowingly opened the hearts of every man who once followed Holt into fire. No one in the town dared interrupt. The children stood on barrels to see. Mothers held their hands to their hearts. Old veterans saluted. And in the silence that blanketed the street, something changed. Not just in Hollow Bend, but in the people. They saw, perhaps for the first time, what it meant to stand with someone without needing anything in return. The ride wasn't loud. It wasn't fast, but it was unforgettable. 300 riders moving as one. Each step forward a word in a language only the soul could speak. When the riders reached the end of town, Elias dismounted. He walked to the center of the road and reached into his coat pocket. From it, he pulled the bullet Holt had left on his windowsill. He held in the sun, let it catch the light, then knelt and pressed it into the dirt. Let this be the last one, he murmured. The riders stopped. One by one, they removed their hats. Not because they had been told, but because they felt it. Felt the weight of the ride, the weight of the man they'd ridden for, and the man who had unknowingly become one of them. And then, just as they had come, they turned. No fanfare, no applause, just the long, slow ride back into the plains, where names are carried by wind and remembered in silence. Elias stood alone in the dust, coat flapping in the breeze. Behind him, the townspeople didn't cheer. They didn't clap. They just watched, breathless, knowing they'd seen something pure, something rare, something eternal. And though no one would ever know the full story, they all knew one thing. A single act of kindness had echoed across 300 miles of wilderness and answered back with 300 riders. The days that followed the ride felt almost unreal, as if Hollow Bend had woken from a long, restless dream. The town was quieter, the air heavier with reflection. People who had once ignored the struggles of their neighbors now found themselves watching, listening, wondering how a single act, a man opening his door to a stranger in the rain, could summon such an outpouring of loyalty and honor. It was a lesson etched in hoofbeats and whispered across dinner tables. Kindness, no matter how small, could never be underestimated in the Old West. Elias returned to his quiet life on the edge of town, but something within him had shifted. The man who had preferred solitude now found company in the memories of those 300 riders. Every night, By the dim light of a lantern, he would polish the rifle he had carried into town, a symbol not of violence, but of protection. The bullet Holt had left behind remained tucked safely in his pocket, a reminder that even the smallest gestures could carry immense weight. And in the silence of his cabin, Elias felt a profound connection to a story much larger than himself. Meanwhile, the riders dispersed, but their bond remained unbroken. They became legends whispered around campfires and in saloons across the frontier. Men and women spoke not just of battles won or lost, but of the man who had saved their captain with nothing but shelter and faith. Holt's sacrifice and Elias's kindness reminded them of the fragile humanity beneath the dust and grit of their daily lives. They rode on, carrying that spirit with them like a sacred flame, lighting the way for those who still needed to believe. Back in Hollow Bend, life slowly returned to its steady pace. Children played in the streets, merchants reopened their shops, and the saloon doors swung wide once more. But the echoes of the ride lingered. There was a new respect in the way people looked at Elias, a quiet acknowledgement that sometimes heroes come in the most unexpected forms. He was no longer just a solitary farmer. He was a symbol of something enduring, a testament to what it truly means to stand for another, without question or expectation. And as the sun set over the rugged hills, casting long shadows across the prairie, Elias stood on his porch, watching the horizon. He knew the ride had changed him, and the town too. But he also knew this was just one chapter in a larger story, a story of hope, courage, and the unbreakable bonds forged by simple acts of kindness. Because in the end, the Old West wasn't just about survival. It was about the people who chose to rise above it. Among the many who had witnessed the ride and the quiet power it wielded, one young woman stood apart. Mara, the innkeeper's daughter. She had watched Elias and the riders with eyes wide not just in awe, but in understanding. To her, the ride was more than a display of loyalty. It was a beacon of change in a world too often ruled by fear and suspicion. Mara had lost family to lawlessness and had long believed that kindness was a weakness. But that day she saw something different. She saw strength. Mara approached Elias days later, offering a loaf of fresh bread and an invitation. "There's talk of rebuilding the schoolhouse," she said softly. "Would you help?" Elias looked at her, a slow smile spreading beneath his weathered face. "I reckon it's time." Together, they gathered neighbors, farmers, and merchants, those who had once lived divided, and formed a plan. The schoolhouse would be a place of learning and healing, a symbol of a town ready to move forward. Work began with determination. Walls rose from timber salvaged from old barns. Windows caught the light like eyes wide open to the future. Children, some who had never known more than hardship, found hope in new books and lessons. Mara taught reading and writing, while Elias shared stories of the ride and the man who had come through the rain. These stories weren't just history. They were life lessons, teaching respect, courage, and the power of compassion. As the schoolhouse took shape, so too did the community. Barriers that once divided Hollow Bend began to crumble. The town that had once turned away a stranger now welcomed newcomers with open arms. Festivals were held, songs were sung, and laughter filled the air, reminders that even the hardest places could blossom with care and commitment. Elias and Mara stood side by side at the ribbon-cutting ceremony, knowing their small acts had sparked something much greater. Yet, amidst the celebration, Elias never forgot the night that started it all. The rain, the stranger, the quiet choice to open a door. He carried that memory like a compass, guiding him through the years ahead. Because sometimes, the greatest journeys begin not with a roar, but with a simple act of kindness, an act that can stir 300 riders to stand together, and a town to believe again. As the seasons turned, Hollow Bend found itself transformed, not just by the new schoolhouse or the laughter of children, but by a deeper, quieter change that settled into the bones of the town. The memory of the 300 riders had become more than a legend. It had become a living example of what could be when a community chose to stand together. Elias, once the solitary farmer, now found himself at the heart of gatherings, sharing stories not only of battles fought but of mercy given. One crisp autumn evening, Elias sat by the fire, joined by Jonah and Brass, the trusted riders who had shared the journey to town. They spoke softly, voices blending with the crackling flames, about the man named Holt. Holt who had disappeared into the storm, leaving behind a legacy heavier than any rifle. They wondered where he had gone, if he ever found the peace he deserved. In their silence, Elias felt the weight of their shared past, a reminder that the West was a place where stories never truly ended, only passed from one generation to the next. Meanwhile, Mara, emboldened by the town's rebirth, began organizing efforts to help those beyond Hollow Bend's borders. She reached out to neighboring settlements, sharing tales of hope and unity born from a simple act of kindness. Letters arrived from distant places, asking how a town so small could wield such strength. The answer, Mara knew, was not in numbers or guns. It was in the courage to open doors when others closed them, to trust when others turned away. As winter's chill settled over the land, Elias found comfort in the daily rhythms of farm life and the steady companionship of the riders who stayed. Together, they prepared for the harsh months ahead, repairing fences, stacking firewood, and sharing meals by candlelight. It was in these quiet moments that Elias felt most alive, not because of battles or legends, but because of the community he had helped nurture, born from rain and quiet courage. And as the snow began to fall, blanketing Hollow Bend in white, Elias looked out across the fields and smiled. The storm that had once raged outside his door had given way to something enduring. A reminder that even in the wildest, most unforgiving places, the simple choice to offer shelter could echo far beyond a single night and inspire 300 riders to ride through a town forever changed. Spring breathed new life into Hollow Bend, and with it came a renewed sense of purpose for Elias and Mara. The schoolhouse flourished, its walls filled with the chatter of eager children learning to read and dream beyond the dusty streets. Mara organized a town meeting to discuss further rebuilding efforts, including plans to establish a community hall where stories and songs could be shared, keeping the spirit of the riders alive for generations to come. Elias, though slowed by time and years of hard living, continued to teach the younger men and women about resilience and honor. He spoke not just of the ride or the stranger in the rain, but of the choices that defined a person. It's not the battles you fight with a gun, he would say, but the battles you fight with your heart. His words settled in the minds of those who listened, planting seeds of kindness in a world that often forgot its worth. One afternoon, a letter arrived bearing a seal from a distant city. It was an invitation for Elias to speak at a gathering of frontier leaders, to share the story of the ride and the power of community. He accepted, knowing the message was bigger than Hollow Bend, bigger even than the 300 riders. It was about the enduring truth that every act of mercy carries the power to change lives, and that true leadership is measured by how one stands for the vulnerable. Mara prepared Elias for his journey, packing his belongings and reminding him of the lives waiting to hear his story. As he left Hollow Bend, the townspeople gathered to send him off, not with guns blazing or fanfare, but with hands held high and hearts full. They understood that his journey was not just a departure, but a continuation of a legacy born on a rainy night and carried on the backs of hundreds. And as Elias rode away, the echoes of hooves faded into the horizon, leaving behind a town forever transformed. Hollow Bend stood as proof that in the Old West, where storms rage and shadows loom, the greatest strength lies in opening a door when the world expects you to close it and inviting someone in. Because sometimes a single act of kindness can stir 300 riders to stand united and a whole town to believe again. Years passed, and the story of that fateful night, the stranger, the rain, the 300 riders, wove itself into the fabric of Hollow Bend. It was no longer just a tale told around campfires. It was a living legacy, a testament to the power of kindness and courage in a land that demanded both. Children grew up hearing how a simple act could change the course of many lives, and how one man's choice to open his door sparked a movement of honor that echoed far beyond the dusty streets. Elias, now older and slower, watched the town flourish with quiet pride. The schoolhouse stood strong, the community hall buzzed with music and laughter, and the fields yielded crops richer than any before. But what gave Elias the most peace was the sight of neighbors helping neighbors, strangers welcoming strangers, a town that had learned to stand together in the face of hardship. The ride had been more than a moment. It was a turning point, a reminder that even in the roughest frontier, compassion could carve a path to hope. One crisp autumn day, Elias received a letter from Mara, now a respected leader in Hollow Bend. She wrote of plans to build a memorial at the town's entrance, a monument not to guns or battles, but to the spirit of the riders and the stranger in the rain. It would be a symbol of resilience and grace, a daily reminder that greatness often begins with the smallest acts. Elias smiled as he folded the letter. Though his days of riding were behind him, his heart still beat in rhythm with the legacy they had forged together. That evening, Elias sat by his hearth, the glow of the fire casting shadows that danced like memories on the walls. He pulled out the old bullet Holt had left, the quiet token of a stormy night and a life changed. Holding it gently, Elias whispered a promise, that the kindness born from that night would never fade, that would live on in every rider who ever answered the call to stand for another. And in the silence that followed, he felt the presence of those 300 riders surrounding him, silent, steadfast, eternal. As the stars blinked awake over Hollow Bend, Elias closed his eyes with a smile. The West had given him many things, hardship, loss, solitude, but it had also given him a story worth living. A story of mercy that rode like thunder across the plains, carrying with it the hope that no matter how dark the storm, there is always a door waiting to be opened, and a hand ready to welcome the weary inside. The memorial was unveiled on a bright spring morning, the sky clear and wide as the hopes of Hollow Bend's people. Families gathered, young and old, their faces lit with reverence and pride. The monument was simple yet powerful, a bronze statue or rider offering a hand to a stranger, horses lined up behind, ready to follow. At its base, an inscription read, "Kindness opened a door. Honor answered the call." It was a tribute not just to Elias and Holt, but to the spirit of a community forever changed. Mara stood beside the statue, her voice steady as she spoke to the crowd. This is more than a monument. It's a reminder. That one act of compassion can stir hundreds to rise. That kindness isn't weakness. It's the fiercest strength there is. And that each of us has the power to change a life simply by choosing to care. Applause rose like a wave, but it was the silent nods, the tears held back, that told the real story. Elias, seated nearby, watched his children place flowers at the base. He thought of the stranger in the rain, of the long ride, of every hoofbeat that had followed. He knew his time was nearing its own end, but his heart was full, because the story would live on, carried in the voices of those who understood that the West was more than a place of gunfights and gold. It was a land shaped by the choices of ordinary men and women who chose to stand for something greater than themselves. As the sun dipped low, casting golden light over the plains, Elias felt a gentle hand take his. It was Mara, her eyes reflecting the same fire that had sparked the ride. "Your story," she said softly, "it's not finished." He squeezed her hand, a smile touching his lips. "No, it's just beginning." And together, they looked out over Hollow Bend, the town that had once turned away a stranger in the rain, but now stood united, stronger and kinder, because someone had opened a door. And so the legacy rides on. Through every open door, every helping hand, every rider who answers the call, not for glory, but for honor. Because in the end, it's not the storm that defines us, but the shelter we offer when it rains. And the courage to know that sometimes 300 riders will come, not to fight, but to ride with you through the heart of it all. In the rugged expanse of the Old West, where survival often demanded toughness and mistrust, the story of Elias Ford reminds us that true strength lies not in how fiercely we fight, but in how generously we give. Opening a door to a stranger in the pouring rain was more than an act of kindness. It was a spark that ignited a movement of honor, loyalty, and compassion that rode through the heart of a town and into the souls of 300 riders. This tale teaches us that the smallest gestures can carry the heaviest weight, and that sometimes mercy is the bravest weapon we possess. Throughout this journey, we've seen how a single choice, choosing to stand for someone without question, can ripple outwards, changing lives and redefining a community. Elias's quiet courage broke the silence of indifference, and the riders who followed proved that loyalty and humanity are inseparable companions. In a world too often divided by fear and suspicion, their ride reminds us that unity and kindness are revolutionary acts, capable of transforming even the harshest landscapes. As you reflect on this story, ask yourself, what doors are you willing to open? Who might you shelter from the storm without hesitation? The Old West was a place of hardships, but it was also a place where people chose hope in the face of darkness. Today, that choice remains with us. We have the power to be the calm in someone's storm, the light in someone's shadow, the reason a stranger becomes family. Let this story settle in your heart as a call, not to grand gestures or heroic feats, but to everyday acts of compassion. Because when kindness rides like thunder through a town, it leaves behind more than memories. It leaves a legacy, and that legacy is alive in all of us, waiting to be awakened by the courage to care. If this story touched your soul, consider joining our community. Subscribe to the channel to journey deeper into tales that reveal the strength of the human spirit. Like the video if you believe in the power of kindness, and share your thoughts below. Have you ever experienced or witnessed a moment when one small act changed everything? Your voice matters, and together, we keep these stories alive, riding forward into the future.